Have you ever wondered what it would be like if Captain America and Optimus Prime were together in the same room? Or if Megatron and Doctor Doom got together to try and take over the world? Personally, I'm not big on crossovers, but even I have to admit that it seems like there would be some rich possibilities for a character-centric crossover between the Transformers and some of Marvel's most esteemed characters. I think in a lot of ways, a meeting between the two properties seems like a no-brainer that practically writes itself. So then, what happened here? In October of 1984, the third issue of The Transformers was published by Marvel Comics. Number 3 in a 4-issue limited series, this issue planted the robots in disguise firmly within the shared universe of various Marvel properties at the time, with the most notable element being a crossover with Spider-Man. In the pages of the comic, the web-slinger teamed up with Gears, if you can believe it. Yeah, that's right. Gears was periodically given stuff to do in the 80s. How about that? Pretty wild, isn't it? 23 years later, in 2007, the Transformers and the Marvel Universe would collide once more in another 4-issue limited series titled New Avengers Transformers. This was a dedicated crossover event bringing together characters and ideas from IDW's current Transformers continuity and what I assume must have been the current New Avengers continuity. I never read the title, so I can't say for sure. And as this is a Transformers-themed channel, the Transformers side of this crossover is my primary concern. Now, some of you may be wondering to yourself why I'm covering this crossover as part of the IDW retrospective. Surely it's not canon, after all. Well, it's complicated. Complicated enough that even if we determine the story to not be canon over the course of this video, the series is still worth talking about due to what it and its accompanying issue, Spotlight Ramjet, seem to hint at what would come next in IDW's Transformers continuity in terms of shifts in editorial philosophy. Before we get to all that, though, it's worth talking about what exactly this series is. New Avengers Transformers is set primarily in the fictional nation of Latveria, dominion of the Marvel villain Doctor Doom. Here we find Megatron and the Decepticons acting on Phase 2 of their infiltration protocol, fanning the flames of conflict across the world with the long-term goal of destabilizing civilization and making the planet easier prey for Decepticon conquest. To do that, Megatron is goading Latveria into a war with Symkaria, another fictional Marvel locale. In addition to having his Decepticons pose as Latverian vehicles, Megatron is making use of a device stolen from Doctor Doom called the Psychoprism to heighten tensions between the two nations. The Psychoprism creates something referred to as an aggression wave, which, as you may be able to piece together from the name, causes humans to become much more aggressive and even violent. The Avengers roster of this book consists of Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Luke Cage, Ms. Marvel, Falcon, and Wolverine. Spider-Man is captured early on, leaving the remainder of the team to grow increasingly hostile as they succumb to the Psychoprism, eventually turning their violent aggression towards the small group of Autobots arriving on scene. Among them are Optimus Prime, naturally, Prowl, Ratchet, Jazz, Bumblebee, and Wheeljack, kind of, but not really. We'll get to that later. Anyway, there's another ingredient in Megatron's scheme he's cooking up, which involves making use of something called mirror response mode, some kind of protocol as well as technological innovation that allows the Decepticons to essentially absorb superpowers, I guess. Maybe it's more of a booster, I'm not really sure. In any case, Spider-Man is selected as the ideal subject to exploit because of something to do with his irradiated blood that can be converted into a sort of enhanced energon isotope. I don't know, it's all pretty vague and a bit of a hokey contrivance to add a deeper connection to the Avengers and the Transformers, but it's also kind of fun in a campy Saturday morning cartoon sort of way, so I'm not too bothered by it. As you might expect with the inclusion of Latveria, Doctor Doom makes an appearance in this series, first helping the Avengers by freeing some of them from the effects of the Psychoprism. Then he seems to join forces with Megatron, which ultimately amounts to nothing more than cheap drama that lives and dies over the span of a couple pages. Look, there were a lot of interesting ideas in here that didn't really take off or go anywhere. Maybe that's due to space or time limitations, maybe because the script just needed another draft or two. I'm not really sure. Regardless, with the clock ticking down, the Avengers and the Autobots have to contend with supercharged Decepticons as they attempt to prevent all-out war and rescue Spider-Man in the process. You can probably surmise that the good guys prevail in the nick of time, and it's thanks to Iron Man's Transformers-sized suit, as well as Prowl and Ratchet, powering up using mirror response mode, fueled by Wolverine's mutant blood. Megatron swears vengeance before retreating, yada yada yada, textbook supervillainy, and then we get a last-page stinger that kind of hints at Ramjet disguising himself as the Avengers Quinjet, but the book doesn't really commit to it, and this ultimately goes nowhere. A recurring theme here. The entirety of New Avengers Transformers was done by a creative team we hadn't yet seen in IDW's Transformers comics, with writing by Stuart Moore and art by Tyler Kirkham, neither of which I was familiar with prior to this crossover, and yeah, this one's a bit of a mixed bag for me. It's a fun crossover, don't get me wrong, but I don't find there's enough to sink my teeth into, so it's not one that I come back to very often. There isn't much here in the way of deeper themes or even character moments, really. It sort of seemed like they were going for something with Iron Man's musings on man versus machine and what it means to be human, but it really fell flat for me for two reasons. First, it ends up feeling like hollow sentiment. The strength of the human spirit, ingenuity, and force of will doesn't really come through here. Rather, it's more of a circular thing where the thing that makes us human is that we're human. Deep stuff. There's no genuine reflection on any specific qualities that make us human or the inspirational qualities of humanity that emerge in the face of adversity. It's just humans good, robots bad, which that sentiment just doesn't really sync up with what this book is, which is the Avengers teaming up with the Autobots. So it's not really man versus machine, it's man and machine versus other machine. Plus, there are these dual instances where that line between man and machine is blurred, like the Autobots powering up Iron Man's armor or Ratchet and Prowl getting a boost from Wolverine's blood. I mean, there's something there, something that could be extracted from all of this about man and alien machines working together and lifting each other up towards a common goal, but there's no reckoning with any of that on the part of the script. Add to that the fact that Transformers fans are very much accustomed to the idea of the Transformers being much more than simple machines. You might even say, more than meets the eye. All of this means that we're really just left with a crossover that is fairly toothless, one that I don't think really plays to the strengths of either franchise. And maybe it's just because I'm more of a Transformers fan than an Avengers fan, so I'm holding their half of the crossover to a higher standard, but I think our resident robots in disguise get the short end of the stick in this series. Take the characters, for example. I don't claim to be fluent in Avengers, but I would argue that this series feels more like an Avengers book with Transformers window dressing rather than a fully fledged crossover of the two properties, if that makes sense. The Marvel side of the world just feels much more alive and vibrant, whereas the Transformers side of things feels a bit stilted. The personality of the Avengers in this series generally fits with what I would expect of these characters. Spider-Man quips, Wolverine is grumpy, Iron Man is a bit of an ass, Doom refers to himself in the third person, and so on. But the Transformers characters? Oh man, forget about it. There's just not much there in terms of character or personality. Most of the Autobot dialogue is interchangeable, and none of the Transformers characters overall really do anything to distinguish themselves from one another. Optimus never really does anything that cool in this book. He never has one of those Optimus Prime moments, which is a pretty big strike against it, in my opinion. And Wheeljack gets sidelined very early on, which also seems like a mistake. I've always felt like Wheeljack is a great way to move the plot along due to his status as a mad scientist and inventor, but that role kind of just falls to Ratchet. And again, it doesn't really go anywhere that's substantial. Not really. Which feeds into the biggest problem this book has in terms of the Transformers characters, which is that there's just nothing here that plays to the individual characters' personalities or unique talents. This is especially noticeable amongst the Autobots, who function as generic heroes in a book that's already chock full of good guys. The Decepticons fare somewhat better, but I think that's mostly because there is a much less crowded roster when it comes to villains, and arguably Doom shouldn't even be counted among the book's bad guys, but you get what I'm saying. And it's hard not to feel like there were some squandered opportunities here. Iron Man and Wheeljack geeking out and working together to create some crazy new tech to save the day would have been a lot more exciting than the Autobots plugging into Iron Man's armor, but that would mean not sidelining Wheeljack, something this book really wanted to do for some reason. And I feel like an actual team-up with Dr. Doom and Megatron could have been cool, but it would have needed to be one that got some time to grow and change and develop a bit before the inevitable betrayal, rather than the rushed alliance and falling out that we got. And then there's Optimus. Like I've said previously, Optimus Prime doesn't really do anything here except stand in the background or say roll out a couple of times. There are no real Optimus moments here. And you can't tell me that there isn't potential for some great character moments between Optimus and Captain America. The art in the book even thinks so, apparently, giving us a visual parallel of the two characters over Megatron's line about Optimus as an old soldier. I know the tone of New Avengers Transformers is mostly on the lighter side, despite impending war, so while too much seriousness might feel out of place, there was still a real opportunity for at least one endearing moment between Captain America and Optimus Prime, and I know that because we essentially got it in issue 5 of Skybound's Transformers series. True, Sparky is not a superhero, he has no powers, but the underlying idea is basically the same. Two old soldiers bonding over their experiences in war. Now, I like to meet a work where it is and not constantly compare it to something else, but sometimes comparison can help us to articulate why something works or doesn't work or what we think is missing, and so on. And in New Avengers Transformers, Optimus Prime is a substantial part of what's missing for me. Sure, he's a physical presence in the book, but the essence of the character is nowhere to be found. Some bold action sequences with him and or character moments between him and the other Avengers or even the other Autobots would have gone a long way for boosting my opinion of this series. This is obviously something that Skybound's series does really well, so when I think about what could have elevated this crossover, I can't help but think about issue 5. The Transformers kind of get the short end of the stick when it comes to the art in this series as well, although don't get me started on this take on Wolverine from the cover to issue 2. Why is he so puffy? But let's not get into the covers. Let's stick to the interior art. Tyler Kirkham handles art duties here, and I have to say I generally like his style. I'm not really familiar with his work beyond this book, but in New Avengers Transformers, he's operating in a style that looks to me like it's influenced by artists like Jim Lee and Mark Silvestri, so of course that works well for the Marvel characters, but it's a bit more complicated when it comes to the Transformers roster. There is some good stuff here, to be sure. The vehicle modes look great, and the general aesthetic is pretty nice. There's a good amount of added detail and line work that makes the characters look mechanical and interesting, and it's very much in keeping with the IDW style of the time. And there's a pretty nostalgic reference to the cover of issue number 3 with Spider-Man and Megatron that's sure to make any fan familiar with the Marvel run break out the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing meme. However, there are a few notable things that miss the mark here. Sometimes the Transformers characters look pretty good, or at least fine, but sometimes they're just a little off. At times, they look awkward and stiff, especially when compared to how Kirkham draws the human characters, which are much more dynamic and natural looking. And what is up with some of their faces? I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think some of them, it just looks weird to me. And then there's the issue of scale, which, sure, scale is often a consistent problem and a point of contention in this franchise, but my issue was less that many of the characters are too tall, but more that the overall scale and proportions of the characters contributes to the Transformers being bland in this book. With how Jazz, Ratchet, Prowl, and Bumblebee are frequently drawn, Optimus Prime fails to stand out as the bulky, imposing presence he almost always is in other depictions. Likewise, Bumblebee and the other cars being so big and bulky makes the team less unique and interesting visually. For me, scale in this franchise is not about focusing on how precisely a character conforms or strays from the holy scale charts, but how it contributes to variety and visual interest for the multitude of characters in the Transformers universe. Some of the characters are smaller, some of them are taller, and different heights in between. I think that just makes it a lot more interesting, personally. If I had to guess, and I am just guessing here, I would say that I wouldn't be surprised if Kirkham didn't really receive much in terms of guidance for some of the minutiae here. Ramjet's appearance being based off the box art for his G1 toy is the biggest giveaway, I think. For the rest of the cast, Kirkham was clearly referencing the work of E.J. Sue and Don Figueroa from the main IDW books, even if he added some of his own personal touches. But Ramjet, who had not yet appeared in the IDW continuity, likely did not have any pre-existing designs for Kirkham to reference. Whether it was Kirkham's decision to use the G1 toy version or someone on the editorial team, I don't know. But it is a somewhat curious choice, though not one that I totally hate, to be honest. I think it lends a bit of charm seeing the character done in this fashion, personally. It's just not very consistent with what we've seen so far and what we would see after this. I don't want to come across like I hate everything in the art here, because that's not true. I mentioned that the Marvel characters turned out pretty good, and there are other things as well. While the Transformers may look a little odd in robot mode, the vehicle modes are actually quite nice, excellent even. And there's some cool stuff that they do there. I imagine that this is a mix of the art and the scripting, but there are points where the vehicle modes are used in clever, unexpected ways, and entertaining ones, like the part where Ratchet deploys his airbag to incapacitate Ms. Marvel. One thing that blew my mind is where Wolverine stabs his claws through Jazz's wheels, as in the rubber of his wheels, and Jazz cries out in pain. This is most likely just a mismatch between the writer's intention and the artist's interpretation, but I never really thought about whether or not Transformers had feeling in their wheels. But now that I have, I'll never be the same again. This is a really, really minor detail, but this energy shield around the array is colored beautifully in this effect that feels like it should be standard for Energon. I know that it's not Energon in the comic, but I'm just saying it should be Energon in other comics. It reminds me of the G1 cartoon in that way, and I wish more effort would be made to give the substance a unique alien visual identity, rather than defaulting to solid colors like we usually see. But yeah, ultimately I think the art in this one is a mixed bag. Like I said, there's some good here, but there's also some real head scratchers. The same could be said for the story as a whole, really. It is impressive how well the team adheres to the world building that Furman was dishing out at the time, but that doesn't mean that it follows it perfectly. And in the end, there are a lot of additions that feel jarring and end up making this one feel like it just doesn't quite fit with the rest of the continuity in terms of the overall execution, art, story, details, all of that stuff. And some of that is obviously due to the Marvel influence with superheroes in specific locations that had not been seen previously and would never be seen again. But even stuff like mirror response mode feels out of place, probably because it's an idea that is never seen beyond the pages of this miniseries. And something about the ending just feels too clean. The heroes emerge victorious and end up losing virtually nothing, which there's nothing wrong with those kinds of stories, don't get me wrong, but it just feels tonally inconsistent with Furman's stories at that point, where victory always came at a cost. And again, that's not to say that there isn't some fun stuff here, because there certainly is. Evaluating it purely as a crossover between the Avengers and Transformers, I would say that it's very flawed, but fun. And if it was plainly and obviously out of continuity, there would be little else to say about it. But it's not that simple. Stuart Moore also wrote a spotlight for IDW centered around Ramjet, which is set after the character appears on Earth in New Avengers Transformers. I hesitate to call this spotlight a sequel, continuation, or even a follow-up to the Marvel crossover because it feels totally different. The absence of any Marvel characters no doubt plays a role in that, as does Robbie Musso's art. We saw Musso's art previously in the excellently drawn Spotlight Ultra Magnus, and I think his work is even stronger here. Spotlight Ramjet is much more on brand for the IDW continuity than New Avengers Transformers in terms of the art, and Ramjet actually looks like you'd expect him to in this universe, clearly drawing inspiration from the G1 cartoon, just with added detail. We also get to see Musso's take on selected scenes from Escalation, pages which are not directly connected to the plot points of Spotlight Ramjet, but are interspersed throughout the issue to show when specific events of the Spotlight story are taking place. These moments from Escalation look great in Musso's style, even if their inclusion has the unintended consequence of making me want to put the Spotlight issue down and read what is, in my opinion, a much better story. Still, I need to give Stuart Moore some credit. This issue is much more cohesive and purposeful than New Avengers Transformers, and it just feels more like a Transformers story. And I mean, yeah, part of that is that there's not a bunch of Marvel characters running around. Everything just feels a lot more on brand. And that doesn't mean it's perfect or amazing or anything like that, just that it's better. The main thrust of the narrative is that Ramjet thinks he's really smart, like super smart, and he's going to use his big old brain to overthrow Megatron and take control of the Decepticons. It will soon become clear, however, that Ramjet is a complete idiot with delusions of grandeur. He tries to recruit Skywarp at the start of the book, but Skywarp wants to see progress on the plan before committing to anything, saying he'll check back in 24 hours. But he also warns Ramjet to tread carefully, and that the Conehead Seeker would do well to heed an old Decepticon saying, "Always bet on the leader." And Skywarp is clearly speaking from experience after participating in Starscream's attempted coup and getting blasted by Megatron in issue 5 of Infiltration. Nevertheless, Ramjet is very proud of his plan to seize leadership from Megatron. And I say it's a plan to oust Megatron, but really that's just part of the overall plan. Ramjet is especially big on this idea that his schemes are non-linear and therefore beyond the grasp of the other simpletons in the Decepticons. His plans involve creating a tracker to keep tabs on Cybertronians, I guess so he can attack and or evade Megatron at the perfect time. I really don't know. Nuking the US and throwing the world into chaos. Promoting a bogus competition within an advanced energy research facility to trick humanity into developing a new source of energy that will replace the need for energon, and thus Ramjet believes Decepticons will leave Megatron in droves and instead follow the Seeker. And then there's also some stuff about using nanobots to control the entirety of humanity, and a superstring space bridge fits into it all somehow. Look, clearly I'm not smart enough to see the full scope of this plan. I'm just a big dum-dum, but having big ideas is not the same as being able to carry them out. Ramjet's operation is on a shoestring budget and is relying on some very questionable allies, with the Seeker delegating the construction of the Cybertronic tracker to 3 little droids called Mini Constructicons, who would feel right at home in one of the Michael Bay movies, as well as the previously mentioned outsourcing of the development of the Energon substitute to unwitting human researchers, all the way to obtaining access to the US's nuclear arsenal by infiltrating the Pentagon with a faulty human facsimile named Harrison. Needless to say, Ramjet doesn't get very far with his schemes before Megatron shows up, presumably being informed of the Seeker's treachery by Skywarp, but it's unclear how Megatron found out about the whole thing. It doesn't really matter, because while Ramjet still thinks he's in control of the situation, he's definitely not, as Megatron easily defeats him and rips out his spark, then scatters Ramjet's body parts at the 3 different locations that we saw the Seeker visit in the issue, while keeping Ramjet's head as a trophy. So I guess the guy wasn't as smart as he thought he was, as Megatron was clearly able to wrap his mind around Ramjet's non-linear genius, all while implementing Phase 2 in Brosnia. How's that for non-linear? Is this the greatest Spotlight issue ever? In my opinion, no. But it's fine. And like Spotlight Kup, it mostly stays in its own lane and doesn't have much of an impact on the main story Simon Furman was telling, which, depending on your point of view, could be a good thing or a bad thing. I do think it ties into the end of Escalation pretty nicely in the sense that Megatron is fuming mad about his defeat in Brosnia and summons Sixshot to jump all the way to the devastation part of the infiltration protocol, Phase 6. With the time for subterfuge being past, it makes a bit more sense why Megatron would make a show out of dismembering Ramjet, not really caring anymore if humans discover the existence of Cybertronians. John Barber would return to this idea in Phase 2 in Robots in Disguise after the Dark Cybertron event, but until then, the events of this issue would largely be ignored and forgotten. Taken together, New Avengers Transformers and Spotlight Ramjet show IDW continuing to branch out, loosening the grip that Simon Furman had over the direction of the continuity. Whether that was due to editorial simply wanting to expand the scope of the universe or trying to drum up more interest in the face of declining sales, or maybe both, I don't know. But these issues written by Stuart Moore along with Spotlight Kup and Megatron Origin were indicators of how fast things could change and ultimately would change over the remainder of Furman's run. There are times when I think about New Avengers Transformers and I can't help but wonder, who was this for? As an avid fan of IDW 2005 and what Simon Furman did with Phase 1, it certainly didn't scratch the itch of giving me more of what I loved about Phase 1. The Transformers side of the crossover seems weaker than the Avengers part, at least to me. I don't know, to be frank, I struggle to see how this series would appeal to either of the respective audiences for these two franchises. I'm certain that it did, and continues to do so, but I think the primary audience for a book like this are people who like crossovers, which sounds like a super obvious thing to say, but there's a long-running tradition in comics with crossovers, and Transformers has an ever-growing list of crossovers and collaborations, and I think there is a real love and passion among some fans for seeing their beloved characters interact with other beloved characters from different universes. So that's the audience that this book is for, and that's okay. It's okay that it's not specifically for me. It's still an interesting series to talk about and consider in the context of the history of the IDW continuity. Now then, on the question of whether or not these issues are canon, well, I'm not sure that there's a definitive answer, but I certainly have my own opinion on the matter. And that opinion is that Spotlight Ramjet is irrefutably canon, whereas I'd say New Avengers Transformers is more of a choose-your-own-adventure approach to canon. Personally, I think New Avengers Transformers can safely be ignored in terms of the larger picture. Some of you may think that if Spotlight Ramjet is canon, then New Avengers Transformers must be canon because of the connective tissue with Ramjet. I can see why you might feel that way, but I just don't agree. I think Spotlight Ramjet functions perfectly fine on its own. Sure, there's a vague nod to Latveria, but it's vague enough that Skywarp and Ramjet could really be referring to anything that might have happened off-panel. It doesn't have to specifically tie into New Avengers Transformers because there is nothing in the text specifically tying it to the crossover, most likely for legal reasons. And it's that vagueness as a result of the legality of the whole thing that I think really gives us a lot of wiggle room when trying to decide whether or not we should include this as part of the IDW timeline. And adding in the crossover to an IDW read-through just makes the whole thing more complicated and disjointed, in my opinion. Part of that is due to bits of continuity that are never seen again, some for legal reasons in the case of the Marvel characters, and part of that is due to the placement of the story set between issues 1 and 2 of Escalation. This crossover doesn't really add anything to Escalation or the sense of momentum leading into Devastation, so I just don't find it to be very crucial to the experience. In fact, I think it just muddies the waters in terms of tone and pacing of the overarching story. It's not essential, and it has virtually no impact on the main story Furman was telling, so I think it can safely be ignored. But ironically enough, it's those same qualities as well as its adherence to the continuity groundwork that allows it to slot into the canon if a reader so chooses. It's really up to each of us to decide based on our preferences and whether or not we think what's actually on the page fits in. Spotlight Ramjet, on the other hand, works much better as a self-contained issue that runs concurrently with Escalation. I just think it fits in better with the IDW continuity overall, even if I don't necessarily think it's the best comic I've ever read. And yes, IDW did in fact include New Avengers Transformers in their hardcover collections of the continuity, and maybe there's a case to be made that because IDW put it in the hardcovers, it's canon. But I just don't know if that's a compelling enough reason. After all, those early hardcovers are also presented in a recommended reading order, which sometimes makes zero sense in terms of chronological order or publishing order. I mean, for example, Spotlight Ramjet appears in Volume 2 of the IDW collection hardcovers, whereas New Avengers Transformers, the story that takes place before Spotlight Ramjet, isn't printed until Volume 3 of the hardcovers. Someone please tell me how that placement makes any sense. Can kind of see why I hesitate to view the hardcovers as any sort of authority on the subject. So sure, you could see the inclusion of New Avengers Transformers as insistence of its canonicity, but personally, I'm not looking at the hardcovers as being the most reliable sources for the timeline with how haphazardly arranged they could be, especially during Phase 1. And you may have gathered by now that I don't particularly love these issues, and look, I don't hate them by any stretch. I enjoy and appreciate things about them. But yeah, I'm not in love with them. I like Spotlight Ramjet more than the crossover, but I'm not exactly crazy about either entry, which is not to say I wanted to see nothing further from Stuart Moore in this continuity. I think his storytelling improved noticeably between New Avengers Transformers and Spotlight Ramjet, so I imagine, had he been given another shot, there's a good chance he would have continued to improve. In fact, we almost got the opportunity for more stories from him during the Costa era, as there was a series in the works titled Legacy of Rust, a 4-issue series centered around Jimmy Pink and Punch Counterpunch. Not much is really known about this series, just that it was written but never published. It's a shame that it never materialized, as Punch Counterpunch is one of the more notable characters that was completely absent from the IDW continuity, and I really think the third time might have been the charm for Stuart Moore's contributions to Transformers. But we'll never know now, unless he's brought back for something completely new in the future. In any case, what are your thoughts on the canonicity of New Avengers Transformers? Do you feel that it's an integral part of the IDW timeline or easily skipped over? Like I said, I don't hate it, but I don't know that I really have that much of an appreciation for it either. And I know the series has its fans, so I'm hoping some of you can share your perspective and enthusiasm to maybe get me to see it in a new light. Anyway, that's it from me on this one. Thanks for taking the time to watch this. It's always appreciated. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.